Did you see what I called this morning session? Come to the
I haven't.
Come to the
Come
dark
to the
side. We have cookies.
We have. Oh, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
We have cookies. That
Oh,
reminds me of when Schiffer approached me in the lobby of the hotel at Reader's Studio in 2009. You know, they had rejected Mysterium in 2007 because they were full.
yeah.
But imagine me being in New York for the first time in a hotel, 8-story, 10-story atrium lobby,
Yeah.
and you hear your name started being yelled out across the lobby, and you're in a group with tarot luminaries, and you don't know if it's Born Identity
Yeah.
or someone has candy, and so I didn't react. I waited. I'm like, well, if I don't react, I can find out who they are before they figure out who I am. They're just yelling my name because I didn't recognize the voice. Little did I know. Then there's that big tug on my elbow, and Mr. Hoggard, are you fond of not answering to your name? And I turned around and I said, well, my mom was very clear about not talking to strangers, but I'm an adult now. So do you have candy?
Yeah. Okay. So I've given everybody the link to join our panels, and we are ready to go. And so Dr. Jung in this section of Answer to Job is responding to the archetype of the apocalypse and John of Patmos's Revelation, which is the last book in the Bible. And so one can wonder what those ancient church fathers were thinking when they put that in the Bible. I don't know. But this is a bit of an answer. So
let me get my book isn't on the right page. Let me get there.
Yeah, on page 81 of the 50th anniversary edition. So I'll begin to read paragraph 716. As a totality, the self is by definition always a complexio oppositorum, and the more consciousness insists on its own luminous nature and lays claim to moral authority, the more the self will appear as something dark and menacing. We may assume such a condition in John, since he was a shepherd of his flock and also a fallible human being. Had the apocalypse been a more or less personal affair of John's, and hence nothing but an outburst of personal resentment, the figure of the wrathful Lamb would have satisfied this need completely. Under those conditions, the newborn man-child would have been bound to have a noticeably positive aspect, because in accordance with his symbolic nature, he would have compensated the intolerable one more time. Wait a minute. Let Brian.
Your pronunciation is tolerable. It's like, no, I hate it when I get in the circle.
Where was I here? He would have compensated the intolerable devastation wrought by the outburst of long pent-up passions, being the child of the conjunction of opposites of the sun-filled day world and the moonlit night world. He would have acted as a mediator between the loving and the vengeful sides of John's nature, and would thus have become a beneficent savior who restored the balance. This positive aspect, however, must have escaped John's notice. Otherwise, he would never have conceived of the child as standing on the same level as the avenging Christ. Okay. You want to take that on? We're on paragraph 716, Brian.
Hey, Brian.
Hey, morning.
Morning. Well, I think, the complexio oppositorum is another way to say actually, the complexio oppositorum would be this psychological construct of the mysterium conjunctus within our own self, capital S self. So that's, I think, the implementation piece of Mysterium Conjunctio. And then I find it interesting, the positive aspect, however, must have escaped John's notice. Otherwise, he could have never conceived of the child as standing on the same level as the avenging Christ. And what's interesting there to me is, Jesus Christ didn't accept Jesus Christ as his Lord and personal Savior to be saved. And so you kind of have that mixed up messianic piece where he was a wonderful guy kind of thing, but he wouldn't be on Instagram, I guess is the
Well, let me
TikTok, as it were. Right?
Let me detox some of these $5 and $10 words you've used here, because the average person isn't going to understand what you said, I don't think. So let's talk about the complexio oppositorum first. That represents the opposites in your nature, because the psyche, the unconscious, is always compensating against its opposite in your conscious mind. And so the complexio oppositorum means that yourself is always opposed to what you're doing one way or another. And it causes you to do dark things, even though you don't intend to do dark things sometimes.
And to qualify the opposition, I think,
right.
Like opposition in astrology, it can also be just clearly seen across the table. They have the complete other half, not necessarily in conflict, sometimes in conjunction, but they are not you. It is something
right.
that's
well, that's why it's called complexio. It's complex, right? And so the point is that what we're doing in Jungian psychology is we're trying to find this middle ground, both in our own unconscious and also in the collective unconscious. We're trying to find the middle ground where we can stand on both sides. We can stand in our consciousness, but we can not be surprised if something comes up out of our unconscious, and then we can deal with it in a more adult and rational manner. Brian, do you want to respond to that?
Not really. Yeah, I guess I had seen this as, is this not the goal?
Well, the goal is individuation throughout
right.
Jungian psychology. Okay, and individuation means that you are always listening to your unconscious, or listening for your unconscious to tell you something. And if you have a dream or a vision, you're getting a message from your unconscious, and it's telling you right now that something is amiss, and you better pay attention to it. Now, you don't always have to agree with it. That's what 1 John 4:1 is about. Consider the spirits, whether they be of God or not. And so we have both God, we have both the good God and the devil within us, and both types of both good and bad can emerge within us through our spirit. And it's up to us, through our maturity, to recognize when something isn't appropriate for society.
Right.
And it's sometimes hard to do that. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
I just think, Brian, I think isn't this the goal? I'd say yes, because I think this paragraph is really laying out a diagram of individuation, just big picture, broad brushstrokes. So I think you're right. Isn't that the goal? I'd say very much so. And it's that always complete, never finished, lifelong. I mean, that kind of gig. It's always at whatever stage of development it's at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm currently trying to figure out what it means to own my inner Trump and my inner Dick Cheney and my inner insurrectionist. No, all the things that I had these strong reactions to
Right.
Mhm.
as other and
Mhm.
Yeah.
not me, and you know, them and all that stuff. I guess I am still trying to sort of figure out what that means about me and being able to cohabitate, with these potentialities and own them, not just have them be like other.
Yeah. That's
That's
the
it.
problem. We have to own them.
Right. The making besties with beasties, so to speak. I mean, I this last week I saw someone with a MAGA hat on, and immediately, instead of just going, that's stupid, how could you, instead of going into that reaction piece, I looked at it dispassionately and decided to, why don't I dose myself with my own medicine and all my preaching dignity and difference, and what will I get then? And immediately the hat became this huge iconic gesture that I associated with the same thing as the tattooed teardrop, that
Mhm.
someone has killed somebody. And there was this, oh, that cap is the last thing you put on before you leave the house. And your thoughts are unconsciously, they take the hat off the rack. Oh, okay, today I choose violence. And it became a little more clear that I don't have that piece, but violence was, in a sense, I beat it out of myself, literally, in 25 years of martial arts, where my joke now is, man who has mosquito land on testicles quickly finds out violence is not the best first course of action. There's gonna have to be a little strategy going on.
You think? Yeah.
Yeah, you think so? Yeah, I think that those pieces, where are they inside, and how do we navigate? And Trump is an absurd example, except so absurd that it's easily distinguishable as other, and not that, oh, I'd never be that dumb. Well, look at the environmental considerations where your fork in the road led you away from that. So how can you look at that as another part of the quote unquote community? And I think then that oppositorum, it's in opposition, and it's also simply seeing something different clearly across the table, but being unthreatened by it in a way that you can engage it more clearly. So when I laugh when it's like, stop your own little hypocrisy, Jordan, dude, this dignity and difference, stop making fun of that guy in your head.
Yeah.
And don't give credit, but look at what's really stirring me up there. And it seemed to be, all of that. It was that iconic gesture that was, similar to the black tear tattooed on someone's upper cheek.
I'm having some success with, what would I say? Generating some compassion for my unliked parts, to include coming to grips with the, I think this is true, that almost every criminal or evildoer is the victim of a trauma, likely in childhood, who is split and lives out these complexes as possessed by complexes, and that they're very damaged. And if you'd ever met that child beforehand, and everybody's has a mother, etc., but even to go, like, there's a path that people have been on that has perhaps engendered multiple traumas over time, and then survival, and then rather than just like cutting to the chase and going, now a child molester should be tortured or whatever.
Right.
That's important, I think, because I've noticed a lot of things in different psychological circles in the last couple of weeks where, you know, oh, damn it, it's not all about trauma. Would you lay people stop talking about trauma, 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 trauma? And I always kind of smirk and go, well, it is always initially about that, because that's another way to say environmental considerations. And once you get past the trauma, then you're not dealing with these, you know, the petty good and bad. I was tortured, I was this, I had this experience or that, and it left this scar, which is motion limiting psychologically. But then once you heal that, then you get to the deeper, more true capital S shadow and self pieces that are the true message of the psyche. As Skip's saying, when you have a dream, when you have those messages coming luminously clearly, that's when you're not dealing so much with only trauma. That trauma is healed, and it gives you, I think, a more full access pass, as it were. And it's not in the nosebleed seats. You know, you're right up in there.
Right.
Because
Right.
the trauma, I think, word covers.
Okay, so on YouTube, Jamal Lindsay has said, I'm studying Answer to Job with Transformation of the God Image by Edinger, and I hope it's enough to help me understand. Well, it starts to help you understand, and we're trying to help you understand here. And so it's a step-by-step process. I gradually learn more and more as I go forward. Now, of course, I just want to demonstrate this dark side to you. So I'm going to show you three paintings that I did for an art show that I had 3 art exhibitions in 2005, one of which was in Greenwich Village. And basically these 3 paintings came from my dark side. Okay. And after I had the 3rd show, which I sold a number of paintings during this process in 2005, I didn't touch a paintbrush until 2019. And so it was kind of a been there, done that, right? But this is what we're talking about. Something is going to come out of you and you don't know what it is. I managed to paint it. It was, a lot of it was quite shocking. I'm not going to show most of the shocking pictures in this public session here, but the important thing to understand is that this was coming out of me. I had another experience 11 years earlier where I had a novel come out of me, and I put that away in a drawer for 21 years. But these 3 images that I'm going to show you will give you a sense of what I'm talking about. And so this was my dark side coming through. I showed these paintings. My wife and mother-in-law, I thought that they would skin me for some of these images that I did, but they loved it. And we did these 3 exhibitions, 2 of them in Annapolis and 1 of them in Greenwich Village. And in each of the exhibitions, everybody came into the room and immediately entered a kind of euphoria because they touched their dark side too. And they didn't know what was going on, but wow, there was just euphoria in the room. And I hadn't expected that. So I'm going to very quickly do this. And so the lucky ones that are live now get to see it, and the rest of you don't. Okay, so here's a first piece. This is me in 2004, and this is one of my paintings. I'm not going to comment on it further, how I did this, but that was one. Okay, then there's this one. Um, okay. And no comment. And then there's this one. Now, this last one is called Numinous Boundary, from the Mundane to the Sublime. And I'm not going to comment on it any further, but it was purchased by a dear friend of ours. And when, well, first of all, she had it set up in an atrium area in her house that you could look through from her living room. And in her living room, she had all of this beautiful art, unbelievable, the great masters, all kinds of things, beautiful grand piano, all sorts of things. But when you saw this through the opening into her atrium, it just sucked all the air out of the room. People had to look at that. And subsequently, she at one point asked me to buy it back, which I would have done, but I couldn't afford it at the moment. And then 2 years later, she was in better financial straits, and I offered to buy it back, and she said, no way. And what she did was she took that piece and put it on her other wall. But it just was incredible how it sucked all the air out of the room. So anyway, any comments on those?
Well, the feminine form painted by the dark, so you're dealing not with, it's a contrast and a negative space in a way, except that it's not just negative space painting or reversal. There's the piece where the form itself, which is usually given light and shadow, is painted by darkness. So I think that in the feminine form is painted by darkness. And so in that sense, there is more of the beautiful Lilith quality that that's being engaged and welcomed and shown and created, as it were. So I think there's an important piece there where just simply the feminine form that's painted with this darkness, which gives it power. And I think that's an important piece.
Right. Brian, any comments?
Well, I think that they're almost Rorschachia or TAT. They're sort of ambivalent.
Right.
You can do whatever you want with that, or do whatever you have to with that. The last one, I don't know, maybe she's getting ready to, or has just nursed.
Yep. Sure.
And so I think that they are, because of their lack of absolute contextualization, and this is what this is what I'm trying to do. I think that's why they're engaging too. Is that they become a hook for either anima complex in men or shadow persona complexes in women.
I like that you said that, because just like photography, painting of that kind, there's this secretly active freeze frame of life where you do not know in context what happened before or what's going to happen after, or even its environmental considerations other than the infinity of the world and the one magnet of the piece of the image. So that one sliver, that one freeze frame has, like you said, that life. It's ambivalent, and it can go so many directions. And I think that's one of the beauties of things like that will be moving, because they move you in your way and not anyone else's way.
Right.
And you kind of can't get around it. I mean, you get outed by going to art. I mean,
right. So this entire show was black and white. Everything was in black and white. And so I said it was black tie. and a lot of people showed up in tuxedos and black dresses, and the paintings were not intended to depict an actual physical event. Obviously, all three of them were taken from photographs, but I used to have a software program that made rubber stamps, and they made them. It made them nicely out of photographs. So what I did was I took those three photographs and worked through all the different versions of a rubber stamp, a black and white rubber stamp, that you could create. And there are literally millions of them. As you work through it, it becomes more explicit or less explicit, and so on. And so I finally would come to the one that I said, okay, this is the one. And then I would paint that. And the result was quite extraordinary, because the paintings didn't give the audience anything really to work with from me. Okay, a lot of them, the ones that came out that way, or that were done in that way. There were some others that were, can I say raunchier, but this style that I had shown you here were done in that way. And when I had this show, I decided, they came through in about 6 months' time, and I had to exhibit them. And so, I organized this exhibition at the local high-class hotel, and invited people to come and wear black tie, which they did. And as I said, it brought out the unconscious in everybody. Everybody saw what they wanted to see. And so there was this euphoria in the room. And but then my 1 John 4:1 came through, and I said, do I really want to be going around showing paintings like this? Maybe not. And so I stopped right there, just dead in my tracks. It didn't even occur to me to pick up my paintbrush for 14 years. And when I did, it was only to paint a portrait of someone that is important in our lives. But, and I don't normally paint now because I know what will come through.
Well, what's interesting to me about, it's a theme in modern literature. Of just the appearance versus the reality. Yeah. And what's interesting to me is, even this, as a totality, the self is by definition always a complexio expositorum. Right. And when it says the luminous nature lays claim, this is what I find it interesting. I'm making a connection here between society today, community today, and lays claim to a moral authority, or to moral authority. The more the self will appear as something dark and menacing. And what's the trickster here is John, the shepherd of his flock. So the shepherd protecting the lambs from the lion, or the wolf. But the reality is, the shepherd's going to eat the lambs.
Well, yeah, and the lambs are all in the psyche, by the way.
Well, right. And so when we look here as what piece of society inside us or outside of us in community lays claim to moral authority, the status quo, the powers that be, well, then there's this kind of look up to, or they make, he and she who have the gold make the rules kind of thing, they rule in a way. So then, of course, then the lambs, so to speak, well, their nature too. So they're not all just, docile, cute, little helpless things. Take a goat, for instance. You walk into a goat pen and stare the lead goat in the eye for 2 seconds. you will be on your rumpus. It will headbutt you like that, right in the navel, just boom. And it's the kind of thing like falling off a bicycle, and you don't know you've fallen off until you're sitting on the sidewalk like, wow, where'd the front tire go? And you look back and, nice little slob of gravel that you just whoosh. But so Nate, with the lambs here, I love this part of, John, also a fallible human being, but that Jung is taking it to be more than the more or less personal affair. So, but I do think it's important noting that, who co-opts the moral authority, and why are these lambs, are they being protected because they're loved, or are they being protected so something else won't eat them? But the shepherd then is the one who's going to eat or sell them or shear them.
Yeah, I haven't deleted these pictures because, and some of them I have put in the dumpster. Okay, but the actual paintings, because they're huge, they're 3 feet by 5 feet, most of them, and I just didn't have space for them. But I have kept the images, and I occasionally show them, as I just did here. And, I cherish them. They are there in my unconscious. And, but I know what they are now. And so this Complexio Oppositorum keeps me going. It gives me psychic energy, among other things, right? So
well, and
anyway.
also I think to demonize them, as it were, we each, I wrote this in my book that went with the deck, it was in the lover's card that lovers love what they love. People like what they like. And I didn't go so far in the book at that point, because we were trying to kidify it. And I realized, though, it wasn't making it childish. It was trying to be more honest, childlike, making the connections. Because in that sense, then, there are no fetishes.
Fetish, and my generation, of course, got introduced to this, and this came up this week because of the death of Olivia Newton-John, when Grease came out, and Sandy, that Olivia played, fell in love with John, what's his name? Travolta, yeah.
Danny.
Bad Boy. Right. And so people love what they love. Okay, let's read on. Do you have a book, Mike or Brian?
Yeah, we're 717.
717, yeah.
But John's problem was not a personal one. It was not a question of his personal unconscious or of an outburst of ill humor, but of visions which came up from a far greater and more comprehensive depth, namely from the collective unconscious. His problem expresses itself far too much in collective and archetypal forms for us to reduce it to merely personal situation. To do so would be altogether too easy, as well as being wrong in theory and practice. As a Christian, John was seized by a collective archetypal process, and he must therefore be explained first and foremost in that light. He certainly also had his personal psychology, into which, if we may regard the author of the epistles and the apocalyptist as one and the same person, have some insight. That imitation of Christ creates a corresponding shadow in the unconscious hardly needs demonstrating. The fact that John had visions at all is evidence of an unusual tension between conscious and unconscious. If he is identical with the author of the epistles, he must have been quite old when he wrote the book of Revelation. In confinio mortis, and in the evening of a long and eventful life, a man will often see immense vistas of time stretching out before him. Such a man no longer lives in the everyday world and in the vicissitudes of personal relationships, but in the sight of many eons and in the movement of ideas as they pass from century to century. The eye of John penetrates into the distant future of the Christian aeon and into the dark abyss of those forces which his Christianity kept in equilibrium. what burst upon him is the storm of the times, the premonition of the tremendous enantiodromia, which he could only understand as the final annihilation of the darkness, which had not comprehended the light that appeared in Christ. He failed to see that the power of destruction and the vengeance in that very darkness from which God had split himself off when he became man. Therefore, he could not understand either what the sun moon child meant, and he could only interpret it as another figure of vengeance. The passion that breaks through in his revelation bears no trace of the feebleness or serenity of old age, because it is infinitely more than personal resentment. It is the Spirit of God himself which blows through the weak mortal frame and again demands man's fear of the unfathomable Godhead.
Okay, lots in there.
Wow.
Yeah, I love the fear of the unfathomable Godhead, which is then clearly saying God is unconscious, the unfathomable. And there's a comfortability with the not knowing that's important there when dealing with the unconscious, that you don't get dissolved by your own intensities. In fact, like going from 3 on the tree in a car to learn to drive to 4 on the floor, and then 5, and then 6, and then someone sticks you in a Formula One vehicle, and you have to have your head attached because the G forces, it's they're 2 cords that hook into the helmet so that your neck won't break when you at 180 turn, and it turns. I mean, so there's an intensity level that I find it can be trained. You're still not going to fathom the unfathomable, but you can swim in the ocean.
Right.
I think that's important.
So this was written about 1,500 years after John of Patmos, who wrote in the 4th century. Jung wrote it in the 20th century, so let's say 1,600 years, round numbers. It took that long for one human being, Carl Jung, to get it. Okay, that's what this represents. And now he's sharing it with us so that we can compare it to our own experience and say, yep, he got it. He got it. And so the ideas of the unfathomable Godhead, I mean, you may be a total rationalist out there and say, well, there's no God up there. There's no devil down there. But that's Jung's point. The Godhead isn't up there or down there. Mm-hmm. It's everywhere, and it's here. Okay. In other words, it's in the collective unconscious. It's being transmitted from person to person at this very moment through this very video. And everyone who's watching this video, either live or in recording, has to compare these words to their own life and see how they fit together.
I think it's important too that the sun moon child, hyphenated one word, sun moon child meant. Mm-hmm. And I see that as a clear reference to the Trinity. Son being the Father, the S-U-N, Son being the Father, the child being the Son, the moon being the Holy Ghost. And what's interesting, 2 things: the sun in ancient cultures was feminine because it was the giver of life, and the moon was masculine. But now the sun is masculine, the way people attribute it, and the moon is feminine, with lunar and poetry, genius, madness, and intuition, waves of that move. The moon literally moves the ocean, so it moves the unconscious. But what's interesting, if I take the gender part away, so that in ancient times you have more matriarchal pieces, the life givers being the ones who are running the show, the moon itself is an excellent example of the Holy Ghost, because just inertly, neither masculine or feminine, the moon does not have any light of its own, so it is inherently all dark. and it is a dark body, as it were. And there's the whole idea dark moon Lilith kind of thing. But that darkness reflects light from an unseen source, i.e., the sun. So there's a reflection piece of how that darkness conveys light. And I think there's a both and there. And that's why it's kind of, it almost demystifies the moon when you see it as a day sky moon in the nice blue sky. You look up and it's like, it's as if it's asleep, but you're seeing it not for what it is. It's just this white thing up there in the sky. And whereas you see it at night and it's, wow, that thing's on. Someone turned the key and that, flick the switch and that thing's working.
Right.
So it's interesting that when it's light in the light, it's more difficult to see because its identity has, in a sense, become one of those paintings. It's freeze framed day, but at night you see its true form of both the dark and the light.
Right. So let me ask Brian this question, which comes up on YouTube. And since Brian is working toward becoming a Jungian analyst, Jamie Perez, who I know fairly well because we've had a number of conversations privately, says, would fear be necessary to avoid ego inflation, at least to some degree? And he says the jewel net of Indra explains that concept well, I think. So, Brian, the questions are, would fear be necessary to avoid ego inflation, at least at some degree?
Right, or consciousness.
Right, consciousness does it. And that's what, Edinger said, what's the answer to almost everything? It's reflection. If you reflect on something and then consciously say, I get it now.
Or at least the awareness when a complex tries to emerge and possess you,
Mm-hmm.
be able to recognize it and make that separation as opposed to it taking over in your ego state. But I think it kind of reflects back to me what you were saying about the intervening 14 centuries.
Mm-hmm.
So the intervening 14 centuries, what was put into it and what was put out, from the magisterium about this document, as being real, or as it's kind of psychotic, even when you think about it.
Yeah, sure.
There are people.
Well, it was psychotic because we had an all good God. That was totally psychotic.
Right. And so the material is just overwhelming, and it is fearsome.
Right.
So maybe that is a counterbalance to God is love.
Yeah.
That you have to be able to hold.
Right.
You can't just have God is love and just have a Satan.
You have to see that God can be both good and bad, good and evil. And we see that very definitely in our current affairs today, both in our US current affairs and in the Ukraine current affairs. And we even see it in Animal Farm, where I'm reading banned books because, as one of my followers astutely observed, for the most part, banned books are intended to protect us. And so people who are banning books are intending to prevent us from being protected by what is coming out of those banned books. And boy, oh boy, do you see it in spades in Animal Farm. It's amazing.
Well, completely. And even in modern culture now, with all the, regulations on women's bodies. I mean, as I think and Brian, I probably said it so many times, I'm sure you've heard it already too, but to me, there should be as many laws on the books about women's bodies as there are men's, and that number is exactly zero, and there's that. And then also the only bodies that have regulations put on them, livestock. So there's, that's a clear example to me of how juvenile, the system can be that way. And, I laugh because there's just okay, little Johnny, senator or representative, you need to go to your room, and you're not going to the pool, and you're going to mow the lawn. I mean, it's like you have to kind of parent this thing, but our culture is too big to parent. And there's a piece that's out of control.
Well, and so we have to allow it to mature to some extent.
Right.
And as Tim points out, human beings are adolescent at this point, and we have to come into a new stage of consciousness. This is the water bearer conscious. A new stage means wisdom falling down from the pleroma down into the human psyche, and enough people have to gain that wisdom. And people run around and consciously think, oh, I'm conscious, I can see all this stuff around me, blah blah blah, and they think that's conscious. Well, no, you're not. You're not conscious unless you've read all the great books and you understand what was going on with the Bible. And history books should now be written and rewritten entirely to go through this development of consciousness, because that is what has driven us, absolutely driven us to this day.
We only see Victor, we only see the Roma Victor, that kind of thing. And it's interesting to me too. I think in that context, if I look at America as adolescent, it's so clear. If I look at the earth historically, America's only 250 years old. It's like 16. It's just getting its stride.
But I'm talking about humanity being adolescent, not just America.
That's what I'm saying is America itself, and Europe doesn't have the same school shooting issue that we have. I mean, the closest front runner, I think, has 5 from 2021. We have over, I think, 200. And, it's the kind of thing where America
200 this year.
Just this year. And when I'm saying adolescent, I mean America itself is only 250 years old. It's 14 or 16 years old relative to other countries. And so here we see more clearly that the culture, the society itself is adolescent in an adolescent country.
Right.
Relatively young.
We're a little different than the Puritans were when they were burning witches.
You got it.
We are deeply wounded. we are separated from eros. We're separated from the feminine. It is othered, even among women. I mean, there's women who are on board with all this because of their wounding. But we are the descendants of the Salem witch hunters.
Absolutely.
Culturally,
and even though you may not trace your roots back to the Puritans of Cape Cod, oh my God, somewhere in the last 400 years, a few Puritans got in the woodshed. One way or another. They may not have done it physically, but they might have done it psychically, and probably did. That's what the collective unconscious is. I'd like to address this question.
Real quick, if I could, to stay with complete out the Salem witch trial piece. If we unpack the fact structure, what's interesting about it is the women being called witches and burned at the stake or drowned or however the torture occurred. The reality was only the men, and only the men who were in the clergy, were allowed to practice healing or medicine. And what happened is there were all these women who were skilled in herbal arts and natural remedies. And there was too much disease, and the men, clergy, were overloaded medically, call it MASH. They're in way past triage. and the ER is full and overflowing, so basically there will be blood. They stepped in to try to take care of the overburden of that. And what happened is, because that went against the authority of only male clergy were allowed to heal or
Right.
practice that, because otherwise it would be of the devil, they were easily able to put, that they are of the devil onto those women unfairly, when in reality, they were literally trying to help. So I hate to put it this way, but no good deed goes unpunished. And you had the women there trying to implement the power of love, and the men couldn't get off the love of power. And
Right.
what happens is, you need to have the power of love with teeth. But the thing is, the teeth don't mean violence. The teeth means stand your ground. But the problem is, the society there then allowed the men to then wash them out by the Salem witch trials, simply because they were breaking the law, except nature's laws were being actually trying to be brought forth by the women.
Right. Okay. I need to interrupt just for a moment. An individual has joined our panel who has chosen not to be visible, and therefore she's not apparently on the YouTube video, but she is invited to speak, and I've made talking permitted for her, so you may speak if you wish. And if you do speak, though, it will be on the recording on YouTube. So you're welcome to make any comment you want. We won't identify you, but thank you for joining us. We're glad to have another panelist, and in this case, a woman, which is always good. So I want to go back and address this question about, would fear be necessary to avoid ego inflation? And I would say you're not going to avoid ego inflation. Sooner or later, it's going to get you. And I have a very big picture experience with that, because for about 15 years, I was traveling mainly all over the Middle East, but to include India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And I kept asking one question. So what is the special sauce that the United States has that makes it the strongest country in the world and the strongest financial system in the world, at least, without putting any good or bad on it? And it's a stump the stars question. People couldn't address this question. And, finally, it dawned on me, which is our diversity, because many of those countries are not diverse, and they're ruled by kings and other rulers, no matter what they're called. And so there's not a lot of debate and questioning of the powers that be in that part of the world. And you can see the consequences of that. Even with Japan, you can see the consequences of it, which is that, the warmongers developed over many years. They were defeated, but then patriarchy came through in Japan, and that got overinflated, and things crashed again. And now new generations of Japanese are quite different from their grandfathers, and also from their fathers, I think. You want to comment on that, anyone? I don't think that fear protects you from ego inflation. That's my point. But
what I find with fear is, I make a distinction between being afraid and fear. And to me, fear is simply my environmental awareness. Fear is my radar that's incoming or slowly moving over here on the right, and it's an awareness. But I think what happens is that if anxiety is present, hijacks fear, it becomes afraid. And I think then what happens is there's the you're in danger, this little, pecking at you in the psyche where that starts towards panic. And like, for example, on the mountain, panic is the most deadly piece because you will move, slip off the ledge, fall and bang your head, be unconscious in the wrong, elemental conditions. It's, 20 degrees and dropping and raining and snowing. And so what I find is instead of fear being important or necessary for that to avoid ego inflation, I think it's anxiety that's necessary, because ego inflation is simply a trickster beating its chest kind of anxiety from my perspective. And in that sense, then the inflation can be taken care of. I think you mentioned, Brian, ego strength, basically. And the ego strength being a synonym of the identity. I mean, your identity and your ego strength are pretty much equitable. They're almost the same, different ways to say the same thing. And I think we need to unpack, when people say ego these days, they typically mean the sociopathic narcissist, the egomaniacal, tantrum throwing ruler, boss, or what have you, that actually, that's not ego. That's egomaniacal. There's a mania that's going along with that ego presentation. Instead of just being ego strength, which is, I have healthy boundaries, there's ego strength kind of thing. And I think the distinction needs to be made between how lay people have, we all co-opt words and then they lose their meaning. Now everyone's like, hey, peace, brother, peace. Well, it doesn't mean I don't want war. It's like aloha. It's like shalom. But except it's lost its meaning of what peace means, kind of thing. So I think the word ego needs to be unpacked. So I think it's a good question of, is fear necessary for avoiding ego inflation? And I think it is. No, fear isn't necessarily. I think it's an ego strength that's necessary to avoid ego inflation rather than a fear. I mean, the fear is not going to put you in place and make good behavior. To me, it's like over scolding a child. They don't change their behavior. They just hide it better. So it's better to empathize with what they do and allow them to not so much, let them know they made a mistake, as it were, but not, rail off the rails, so to speak, and storm at them. Because then all they do is they're going to do it again, but then they'll just hide it better.
Right. Well, and I think that's the consequence of, if you put it in psychological terms, fear towards aspects of our inner life are going to shadow them. And you may not get ego inflation if you're afraid of content, but it's not coming out. It's going to come out in unconscious ways and complex ways and ways that are awkward and unrefined and not a tool, but more like a flood. So I think that's the conscious, and I think that's common. Like this whole 1400 years of revelation and that sort of fear towards the Godhead, I think separated people from much of the sacred in their psyche.
I think you're absolutely on the money there. And that's that whole co-opting the moral authority. I mean, it's a shame that the church was given the reins to moral authority, because people associate morals with religion, and they're not the same thing.
Well, and of course, we see this coming through in our current affairs last week, because our former president, as soon as he hears that he's been invaded, immediately starts spewing lies about what's at stake here. Part of that is a self-defense mechanism, which is to make things as confusing as possible for everyone, so we could never seat a jury against him. That's the theory. Make it as confusing as possible. And, what he fails to understand is that in selecting a jury, both his counsel and, his counsel would certainly try to select his, very strong followers. But what happens is we tend to get people who are not very conscious on the juries. We get people who are not very conscious about current affairs. And so, for example, as an attorney, I've never been allowed to serve on a jury because I know too much. And so all I have to do when I'm called for jury duty, which does happen sometimes, is I go in and say, well, I'm a lawyer. And they say, okay, go home.
It's interesting that because that's an absolute truth. 99.99, take the 9 out forever percent of the time. And I laugh because the one time I've been on a jury that ended up being a jury trial between 3 insurance companies. I think I've mentioned this to you before.
Mhm.
But what's interesting is, so when they're going through jury selection, I'm up in this front row of these 3 rows, and they come to me on 3rd or 6th, or in the first part. So I just rip off. It's clear. I'm like, clear the spit from my mouth, like I don't have a pop guard. I'm on the radio kind of thing. I want clarity, and I want slow enough to hear, but fast enough to say nimble. So the attorneys go, oh no, he's going to make his own decisions, out of the room. Well, so I'm using every acronym, every license I have, acronym define, this and that and the other, going through architecture and accreditation boards and chair of community format identity and all this kind of stuff. And then I stopped and I said, well, did that respond properly to what you needed to hear in my response? Oh, yes, sir, it did. Well, so we're going through, right? Well, there are 2 insurance attorneys behind me, and they're like, okay. And one of them taps me on the shoulder. Nice tactic. Good for you. We'll all 3 go out for coffee or drinks after, because they're going to kick us right out of this room.
Right.
Well, they come back about 30 minutes later and they say, okay, Mr. Hargard. And that's me. And so I stood up fully and I turned around and smiled to them. And I fully expected, okay, I'm going to wait in the hall because we're going to go hang out somewhere and have some coffee. And I laughed. They said, please report over there. You'll be juror number 1. And both of them at the same time went, oh shit. So that's what they had wanted. And that was the one anomaly. So we were playing the rules. We were playing by the rules to try to get, not selected. And because of that, we played directly into the selection. So I think the anomaly piece is important to account for in these. So I think that's another part of ego inflation. You tend to dismiss things that are subtle and actually very powerful with ego inflation. And since it's too bright and it covers the nuances out. So it's just I think, example of that jury piece of relative to ego inflation. You get too bright, you think you know exactly what to do, and you completely miss steps. And I was just, facing the hands like, oh no,
So you were caught.
I was caught, and it ended up being 2.5 weeks. And here's the thing, when you get caught on those things, this was an insurance company plaintiff suing an insurance company defendant, except the co-defendant was the casualty company of the plaintiff. And the plaintiff and the casualty company was a subsidiary of the defendant. So we would have cross, recross. I mean, it was 9, and then you switch to 2, and then flip back, and then switch to 3, and so that's 27 iterations of the asking. I mean, I think at the end I had 196 pages of notes in a notebook because keeping track to keep it simple, you almost had to overnote to keep yourself on the level of what they just try to slide by kind of thing.
Right. Jordan, please read 718.
Got it.
This is a new area we're going into now. We finished with the apocalypse.
Yeah, part 14 here, paragraph 718. The torrent of negative feelings seems to be inexhaustible, and the dire events continued their course. Out of the sea come monsters, in quotes, with horns, in parentheses, in essence, endowed with power. The horrid progeny of the deep. Faced with all this darkness and destruction, man's terrified consciousness, quite understandably, looks round for a mountain of refuge, an island of peace and safety. John therefore weaves in a vision of the Lamb on Mount Zion, where the 140,000 elect and redeemed are gathered round the Lamb. Footnote 1, it may be significant that there is no longer any talk of the great multitude which no man could number, from every nation, from all tribes and people and tongues, standing before the throne and before the capital L Lamb, who were mentioned in 7:9. And coming back to, they are the, that's PA.
The male virgins
Yeah.
in Greek.
So what was that?
They are the male virgins. You can read it that way.
Right, but it's a PA theta, so it's like,
Yeah, it's Parthenoi, like,
yeah, Parthenoi.
like
Yeah, okay, there we
virgin.
go. Yeah, they are the Parthenoi, the male virgins, in quotes, which were not defiled with women. Yeah. Anyway, they are the ones who, following prudish abomination of, anyway, they are the ones who, following in the footsteps of the young dying God, have never become complete human beings, but have voluntarily renounced their share in the human lot and have said no to the continuance of life on earth. If everyone were converted to this point of view, man as a species would die out in a few decades. But of such preordained ones, there are relatively few. John believed in predestination and in accordance with higher authority. This is rank pessimism. And then the verse piece, everything created is worth being liquidated, says Mephisto. Yeah, everything created is worth being destroyed. I mean, this actually goes into that British current affairs. I mean, the 14-year-old snickering at sex jokes, unevolved, still doesn't know. That's not really very funny. That's just that's actually an anxiety reaction. It's a nervous reaction that is prudishness.
Well, and the laughter comes from the unconscious, because it's what comedians do is they say something that hits something in your unconscious.
Right.
I mean, in a way, it's the same as the images I showed earlier, where people walked in the room and suddenly the reaction is euphoria. It was something that they would never put up on a painting, but oh, by the way, it's in there, whether they consciously recognize it or not. And so, anyway, I think we ought to read the next paragraph too here.
That youthful embarrassment, I think of that. You know, this paragraph, which in quotes, which were not defiled with women, as if the sexual act was somehow bad. And, like you said, well, if you stop that, then we'll all be gone in decades.
Right.
So, but the putting forth the church against the natural order is what this is starting to put forth.
Right. And so what we all have to recognize is every single one of us is descended through millions, literally millions of generations since first life on earth, since the first single-celled living organism. Every one of us is descended from our ancestors who did two things successfully. They survived until they reproduced. They survived until they reproduced. And if you get in the way of that, then your progeny will die out. Right?
Well, it's interesting about someone this week was going through like ontology and origins of the beginning. So there's a piece there that's hard to chew of, well, but where did it start? Oh, it has no beginning, it has no end. Well, the circle is just a curved arc until the lead passes over the lead and it looks like it had no start, but where did something start? And so, time as a construct was being wrestled back and forth. And I love it because before it got too out of hand philosophically, losing the mythology of it, someone said, look, here's how it goes. So God is talking to Jesus, and Jesus says, Dad, for all time and forever, and well, who's that Queen Elizabeth character over there? And God says, I don't know. She was here when I started.
Okay, I think we should read 719.
Okay.
This only moderately comforting prospect is immediately interrupted by the warning angels. The first angel proclaims an everlasting gospel, the quintessential of which is fear God. There is no more talk of God's love. What is feared can only be something fearful. Okay, so this comes up in Animal Farm too, but the point being that the church fathers who were putting this in the Bible wanted everybody to be fearful, and of course most people didn't understand what all this apocalyptic talk and Revelation was about, and so everybody was afraid. And so I'm going to leave it to you guys to comment on this, and I'll be back in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Brian, thoughts?
Well, I mean, I've always been the people that I have run across in my life who have spent the most time and energy with the text, are essentially, Protestant fundamentalists.
Right.
And what is amazing to me is after 1400 years, how much it somehow hooks some kind of thinking function, I think almost as a defense, because they are trying to decipher this,
right,
in terms of what's happening now and what's gonna happen, even though that's been going on for 100 years, and yet that is a repeated response to this. And it's just kind of interesting that there's something about the text in this exile of love, and it's almost like a return of Yahweh in a way.
Right.
It's like a regression towards the one who basically their response to Job was, you can't touch this because I could do all this, and your spark of the real Godhead that says this isn't good enough, like I play the you don't get me, you're not as strong as me card. But there's something evocative about that when we sort of regress from Jesus, God is love, into this material. I
think so. And I think what's interesting, what is feared can only be something fearful. The lamb itself is not fearful. It's not a menacing thing. It doesn't have horns. It's not the big ram kind of, Pan, the half goat god. The lamb is pretty, oh, look at the pretty kitty. It's cute in a way. It's soft. But what's interesting, I think what you were saying is, along those lines of the people who study the scripture or the text the most, the Protestant the fundamentalists of any given group, what's interesting is then the mistranslations can take root even more. For example, the meek shall inherit the earth. The word meek is a poor translation of the Hebrew. It doesn't mean the lamb, the weak. I mean, it was always upsetting to me. And I remember talking to my dad, who he would, before Sunday school each week, he would take out his Hebrew version and he would translate the passages himself to make sure that he had a comparison to fact check even just the letters and the scripture he was going to use for that Sunday school session. And he said, oh, well, the meek is one of the worst translations. He said it attributes to the lamb. It meek seems like very lamb in concept. So people accept it just, without even a thought. The translation from the original Hebrew of meek, or what they've translated into meek, was actually one who has a sword, is skilled with the element of the weapon, and keeps it sheathed. So what happened is it's basically not meek, it's not weak, it's not lamb. It's someone who has come with the sword sheathed, which means I come in peace. Mm-hmm. And that's different than meek in total. I mean, fire sale total. So to me, just that aspect of the translation of, again, one word, meek, as Skip has brought up with Papyrus 66, changing I to theta, cuts the Mary chain, I love the band, the Jesus and Mary chain from, the 80s. I mean, it cuts the Jesus and Mary chain and switches Mary to Martha to go from.
No, it switched. Yeah, the change switched it from Mary to Martha, but in truth, it was Mary.
Right. But what happens then is that's another way to stamp down and stop the Mary piece as the tower from continuing, and then in a sense defeat the feminine to go to the patriarchy, and
very much so.
Keep the superficial ignorance, as it were.
Yeah, and from my own experience, I know that these, fearful things that these fire and brimstone pastors use, does work in your psyche, because I just want to just quickly point to my own experience with my daughter, saying that she thought I was going to hell. And that night I had this vision of Mephistopheles, as I had imagined him in Faustus, plopping down in the passenger seat of my car. I mean, I had that vision. It was a real thing. It was quite real, and it could have caused a car accident or whatever. And so, fortunately, I was far enough along in my study so that I said, well, you can have my immortal soul at my death, provided none of my daughters ever think that of me for the rest of my life. And he left, right? So, I suppose it'll be Katie bar the door when I die, but, until then, he's never come back. But, that was a real vision. And so when these early church fathers were putting this in, and fire and brimstone guys were, putting all this horrible imagery in their sermons and so on, I'm sure that lots of people had really scary dreams and visions, right? Throughout the last 2 millennia. And so they make it so God is fearful. Well, we should be afraid of God, but God is something different from what they were saying. God is the collective unconscious, and the collective unconscious we don't have control of, even in the United States. We have a bifurcated collective unconscious in the United States right now, and we don't know where it's going to go. And
I think that's a great example with the Mephistopheles just appearing in the car, and then I think the oppositorum of that in seriousness, where then now from your perspective you see how that was natural, how that could get in and move you that strongly. where then you can also turn around now, it seems, and I mean, I can, the devil appears and, ragey, trying to take over. And I'm like, oh, come on, dude. I'm not afraid of someone who had their golden fiddle stolen by a Braves fan. It's like,
Yeah.
What were you going to say, Brian?
Well, what's interesting is that, this stuff going on inside, but this whole exteriorization that happens in response to this, because there's people that say, I know what Magog is. I know it's now it's going to, instead of Russia, it's going to be Iran or what, I'm just saying, like, people are like caught up in figuring out to the, minute,
right.
you're doing the math and all this stuff. And it's like, it's not that,
Right.
Right.
This is not an exterior, real world set of stuff. This is the stuff that we're, but as a consequence, there is a refraining for looking within.
Mhm.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's right. And we should be careful about saying real world, because these things are quite real.
Right.
Okay. In other words, when I saw Mephistopheles in my passenger seat, he was quite real.
Right.
And he could have caused an auto accident that day. I'm lucky it wasn't a snowy day with ice on the road.
So let's say, well, I guess, what would one say? Because that was a more of a vision or a dream.
It was vision.
Right.
Because
So
I
I
was
guess
driving
you
at
can say
65 miles an hour.
Right. So I guess we can't even say the waking world. Um,
No, you
what
can't.
nomenclature do you want to use? The more
Well, it came from my unconscious, clearly.
right.
Well,
But
it
that's
seems at the level of the intensity of a theosophic vision. I mean, it's.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm trying to emphasize here is people can have visions and dreams, which are terribly frightening and scary. We have to keep them in context and reflect on them. And the way to cope with them is by bringing them into consciousness and reflecting upon them in a certain way. Now, in that case, as I said, that night, I fell into hell right at that moment, literally. And it took me 10 years to find my way out. And it was only because of Carl Jung that I was able to do it, because after 10 years of reflecting on it, I now know what it is. But wow.
That came at your soft spot for your daughters, as if that's
Sure.
a bad thing. That's a wonderful piece, but then in a sense, that's the beautiful vulnerable piece where your courage will rise to, I'll do anything. You need to leave them alone. I mean, so
Right.
there's, that's operating there.
Well, there's a question here. Kathy asks, Skip, if I may, did you share your vision with your daughter? And the answer to that is I have not. Okay. Except that there's no secret about it. It's in lecture 5 of my first year of doing this website. And my other 2 daughters do know about it. My one daughter who was involved is very committed to Christianity. She's got 3 of her sons in Christian school, and not in public school. Now, I think that this has started to come around and bite her, because a couple of years ago, my elder grandson in that family, there are 4 in that family, insisted on being able to go to public school. And he graduated from a public school, and yesterday he started college. So, she has been trying to shelter her sons and her family from information beyond the Christian message. And that sheltering is over for him, and probably was over a couple of years ago. And so, no, I haven't specifically discussed it because, you know, she's very sensitive about any criticism of the Christian story. And so I've tried to show her that I now accept and believe in the Christian story. So a year and a half ago, I gave her one of Tim Holmes's sculptures, which is called the Christian Vine. And she represents my Christian vine. And I didn't go into a lot of detail and discussion about what this meant. I simply got her to put it on her mantelpiece and let her reflect on it over her time, in her own good time. And this year I gave her very carefully worked out calligraphy with John 1:1-14 written out in my own hand. And so in both cases, she appreciated that. And, you know, so gradually we're coming to a central place, because I don't deny Christianity. I'm saying every word of the Bible is true. Every word of the Bible is true. The question is, how is it true? Mm-hmm. And what I know clearly from 1970 is that the Christian message has lost its power for most men, whether they go to church or not. And the reason I know that is because in 1970, I was on a combat base in Vietnam with 5,000 Marines. And the chaplain would come to the colonel's briefing every morning, or every Monday morning, and he would report on how many of the Marines had come to church on the day before, on Sunday. And the number was always something 11 or 12, like that. It wasn't half of the regiment or anything like that. And so what I'm struggling with and working with through Confluence and everything, and through working with some pastors, is the fact that that chaplain was not addressing the spiritual needs of those men. And I infer from that experience that that there are a lot of men whose spiritual needs have not been addressed. And what do I know about my spiritual needs in Vietnam? Well, I didn't go to church either, and I still don't go to church, but that doesn't mean I don't endorse the Christian message, and I don't endorse the importance of cathedrals and that sort of thing. But my spiritual needs were raised. First of all, they were crashed shortly after I started to observe this, when I was told I wasn't going to be able to go to the Bob Hope show. Okay, I was at a combat base 40 miles south of Da Nang, and Bob Hope was going to perform with the Gold Diggers in Da Nang, and I was looking forward to the possibility of going to that. And I learned that I wasn't going to get to go to the Bob Hope show. And then about a week later, I got desperately ill, okay, from food poisoning. And I was really ill because I had 104 temperature, and I got sent to the hospital by the doctor. And I lost, I weighed 220 now. I went down to 157 pounds at that time. And so I was sick, but I got to go to the Bob Hope show wearing in blue pajamas. And that raised my spirits hugely, right? So I know something about spiritual needs, right? And so then I was informed very shortly after that that the date of my R&R had been changed. Normally it was 6 months after you were in Vietnam. And that would have been early January of 1971. But I was told, oh, you're not going to get to go until April or March. And meanwhile, my wife was about to get on an airplane to fly to Hong Kong to meet me. And I had to call her up and tell her that we weren't going to get to go to, I wasn't going to get to go to Hong Kong. So if she goes, she's going to be alone. And so we were able to reschedule it, 8 or 10 weeks later. But the point was that my spirits were crushed again when I had missed the date. And then they came back up when I got to go to Hong Kong after all. And then, I don't know, 12 days later, I rotated out of Vietnam. So that helped my spirits too. What?
I love that whole idea here where, well, no, son, there's more than one way to sneak into a theater. Don't use that back door with your friend that's already in there. You can also almost die. It's a more intense way to get into the theater for free. I mean, to sneak in. So I love it.
Yeah.
The perils and the travails of, this gauntlet that, oh, well, this is your spirit going, oh no, we'll get you into the show. You're going to almost die. But
right. Okay. So Brian, would you read paragraph 720, please?
Yeah. The Son of Man now appears holding a sharp sickle in his hand, together with an auxiliary angel who also has a sickle. And there's a footnote 5. Or 5. Oh, okay, this is a Bible verse. But the grape harvest consists of an unparalleled bloodbath. The angel gathered the vintage of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God, and blood flowed from the winepress, in which human beings were trodden as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia. And that's a stadia or a distance measurement.
Yeah.
So you said before that, the Battle Hymn of the Republic is drawn straight out of this.
Yes.
And to me, this is very much like the first visions that Jung had.
Yeah.
Right.
Into the Red Book.
Mm-hmm.
It's
very much. Yeah.
Of the depths.
Yeah. So mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. His wrath will, is going to trump out the vintage of the wrath. I forget exactly how it goes, but about how the words go. But if you compare the words of the Battle Hymn of the Republic and the last 22 verses of Revelation, they are there. And you had the army of the North thinking that they were the winepress, the wrath of God.
That whole scene in The Matrix, where all these babies are just egged, as it were, on these vertical technological branches. They're on the vines, literally, so to speak. And that's lifted almost uncreatively. Very beautifully. But it's interesting, we're going from the lambs and the livestock to now people are fruit and grapes to be, plucked, as it were. And there's an interesting piece here. The powerful part is you are part of nature, but the less than powerful part is that you're of not much consequence. So there's a demeaning piece that often then the ecclesiastical structures will capitalize on to make people feel less important, or even not in any way personally affirming their own life.
Right.
I had a client a couple years ago who had basically done the detox from very, very intense fundamentalism growing up.
Mhm.
And she said at one point, she goes, they would tell us to mine our minds for sin. And what that is the abuser who's now relinquished from abusing someone to get someone else to torture themselves to look at, because they're always not good enough and they can't do anything wrong if they found sin. So even in just completing that exercise, it's one of the, it feels like B.F. Skinner must have invented that torture technique because, he was so good with that manipulation for example, the CIA, rather than psychology, it was manipulation. And
right. And I just wanted to go back to something that was going on here on YouTube where C. Duvall says, restore the balance between me and my daughter, which I've been trying to do, of course. And Kathy says, I can understand many reasons why you would or wouldn't. Interesting that the other two have received you in this. People draw out such different sides. So what I would say is that I chose a backdoor way of addressing it with her. And the result of that is that she's really quite sweet with me over the years since then. This was 23 years ago that it happened. And, we have a very, very good relationship with her now, I think, and I do. But I don't discuss my opinions about religion with her, because she's a bit rigid there. But I think her sisters know what happened. I've told them, and I sort of took a less confrontational route by going through them to let her know that this was not on. And she gets it, I'm sure. I don't have to confront her directly.
I think it's a powerful gesture that you simply gave her the sculpture. There's a visceral set of images, so she can stay with the image, and you're not telling her what to do. And so she can live her way into what's her story with this sculpture.
Mm-hmm.
And that way, I think it's actually less confrontational, but I find it to be more of a big brushstroke, large form gesture that is more loving because it's respecting her instead of playing the you did this, you did that tit for tat, and giving more of literally a full-on contribution to stay with the image, as it were, rather than.
Well, I did, and I did say to her when I gave her the sculpture, I said she was my Christian vine, right?
Yes.
And that's what the sculpture meant. Okay, so let's see. I don't know what you wrote here, Brian. So should I read it or
those are the lyrics of the
oh
yeah, okay.
Metal Hymn of the Republic.
Yeah. Right. Okay, let's go on then. And
721.
721.
7 angels then came out of the heavenly temple with the 7 vials of wrath, which they proceed to pour out on the earth. And there's a Bible verse. The pièce de résistance is the destruction of the great whore of Babylon, capitalized, proper noun. The counterpart, the whore of Babylon, the counterpart of the heavenly Jerusalem. The whore is the chthonic equivalent of the sun woman, Sophia, with, however, a reversal in moral character. If the elect turn themselves into, in quotes, virgins in honor of the great mother Sophia, a gruesome fantasy of fornication is spawned in the unconscious by way of compensation. The destruction of Babylon therefore represents not only the end of fornication, but the utter eradication of all life's joys and pleasures, as can be seen from 18, lines 22, verse 18, line 22 to 23. The sound of the harpers and minstrels, of flute players and trumpeters, shall be heard in thee no more, and the light of a lamp shall shine in thee no more, and the voice of bridegroom and bride shall be heard in thee no more.
Well, if this doesn't scare the crap out of early Iron Age men, I don't know what would.
Well, I was just going to say, ouch,
Yeah.
Boom, wow, sorry, Johnny, we're going to take away the little baseball, no more playing, it's like life is over. And then I think there's a footnote about the, what's it on the previous page? Yeah. Where footnote 3, they really belong to the cult of the Great Mother, since they correspond to the emasculated galley. See also the strange passage in Matthew, verse 19, line 12, about eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, like the priests of Cybele, who used to castrate themselves in honor of her son Attis.
Oh, boy.
The big stuff going on there.
Yeah. Moving on, 722. As we happen to be living in the end of the Christian eon, Pisces, one cannot help but recall the doom that has overtaken our modern art. So Jung had a hard time with modern art for decades, actually. And he saw the psychological crisis that was happening in the 20th century through that art. And he discusses that in broad detail in volume 15 of the collected works of C.G. Jung, especially in his essays on Picasso and James Joyce. And so
I remember being vindicated when I found Jung had such a problem with modern art, because I remember in our theories and methods class in architecture, I could only call it rantras. These were like capital R rants that at the level of a mantra that, I would go off about how modern architecture, these boring concrete square boxes, were Job standing in ashes, devoid of any identity, detail, or flourishing feature kind of thing. And you want to talk about being a crusader. I was so against these, undetailed boxes, but I didn't realize that I was really just playing a Beaux-Arts advocate of, why are you stealing my beauty? And it was just such a jarring aesthetic that it surprised me. And I would say I was afraid of it. And so there's that'll send you into the us versus them. And I laugh that, soon after, here comes the sports car, and my stepmother goes, "Oh, you are going to get married. You just married an object." It's like,
right. So Brian, why don't you take on 723, since it's a very archetypally Jungian paragraph.
Right. Symbols like Jerusalem, Babylon, etc., are always overdetermined. That is, they have several aspects of meaning and can therefore be interpreted in different ways. I am only concerned with the psychological aspect and do not wish to express an opinion as to their possible connection with historical events. Indeed.
Yeah.
And that's actually smart of Jung, because then he sidesteps the sequence of a fact structure and goes more with the content of the concepts that have been played through the culture, regardless of when they appeared.
Right. But this is what I do. This is what this YouTube channel has been about, is to show connections between what Jung was saying, what the Bible was saying, and what's happening to us right now. And helping people move to this next stage of consciousness where we realize that we have to reflect on these issues that are bubbling forth in our unconscious and find answers to it. It doesn't mean that fundamentalists are wrong in what they do, what they believe. It means that we have to think about them, and that's one thing I really like about Tim Holmes' sculpture, is that it doesn't have to say anything really.
Right.
And we finally were trying to agree on the words that would go down on a plaque to be put on the large version of the water bearer. And we finally boiled it down to about 2 sentences. And we put in Proverbs 8, just the reference to the chapter. And someone argued that we shouldn't put that there because it was fraught, because but it's actually part of the Jewish Bible. It's in the Old Testament, right? And but we had to do that to show the meaning, so that people would understand what the meaning is. And
well, I think that's important to also, that's a big corrective in how to make sure in life you always have a cornerstone to brace against, or a handhold. Because if we look back, a couple paragraphs, look at all these scare tactics. Hi, we're going to remove pleasure, sex, anything of joy. And that scares the bejesus, literally, pun intended, bejesus out of people. And what's interesting is that then now it's important to look at what are the true concepts that are functioning as the heart of the matter, versus what are the scare tactics that are trying to get people to get pushed one way or another.
Right. So when I'm talking about the water bearer, I'm talking about this sculpture by Tim, which shows Sophia, or the wisdom being poured into the bowl of adolescent humanity, not adolescent man, but adolescent humanity. So the wisdom is coming in, and it's that wisdom that the fifth stage of consciousness is about. We have to wake up. And
well, and what I love most about that Aquarius, the water bearer, is that the pouring is from the heart, and it's formless. And the fact is, the vessel then is the ego strength, the form that gives form to the formless. So the eros is poured into the vessel of the psychological ego construct to fill it with life, rather than just being a dead fish scale, and that way I find to be an integral part of the psyche, instead of, people say, kill your ego. You don't want to amputate any parts of your psyche. I mean, that's just danger land. So I think what I love about the water bearer is, the arrows poured into the logos, the heart of the matter, given form and place and home.
Right.
And
so as everybody sees now, they're a true symbol, like the symbol of the water bearer,
right,
has many meanings. It has meanings to me. It has meanings to Jordan. It has meanings to Brian. And it has meanings to all of us without talking about it. Okay. In other words, when people see this in this square in Helena, Montana, it's going to touch them very deeply. Okay. And so anyway, go on.
Well, I was going to also say about, just going back for a second, the danger of splitting off. The text about that is anti-erotic. That is animating. That has animated movements throughout sort of the monotheistic tradition, from the Essenes to the monastic tradition to, not quite Sufis, but there has been this as a split off, but animating and powerfully and also destructive because it is a split.
Right. But it's also a fundamental mistake in the verbiage by calling it anti-erotic. Even Tim made this mistake where he talks about the erotic crisis. Well, it's not the erotic crisis. The erotic crisis conjures ideas of pornography and all sorts of other things. It's the eros crisis and not understanding the duality between logos and eros. Logos being the structure upon which we live our lives, including imaginary things like Bibles and stories, and that's all logos. Every time a word comes out of my mouth, it's logos. But the eros is my life. It's how I react to it. It's how you react to it. That's eros. Okay. And that is where we live our lives. That's the point. It's not an erotic crisis, which conjures up too much other stuff. It's the fact that the opposite of the word is life itself.
Well, actually, I would stand on the side of it is an erotic crisis, because something that is erotic arouses the soul, arouses the body, is an arousal. Pornography is violence and war. That is not, pornography is not erotic. It's a whole different subset thing. And what's interesting to me is that eros is inherently erotic, meaning, like Alan Watts would say, a life-affirming spirituality. It is moved. And so to me, the erotic is not bad. It is moved, life-affirming, moved. It has that.
No, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not saying it's bad. Okay. And I would never say that anything that emerged from Tim Holmes's mouth since I've known him has ever been bad. Okay. And so when he refers to it as the erotic crisis, I only want him and everyone to have a broader view of it, and not only the part of the view that creates this duality of something bad about sexuality. There's nothing bad about sexuality.
No. I get your point completely, and I resonate with it. And I also think that the erotic is a necessary concept to keep people from being scared into being prudish. Because honestly, the first thing that comes to my mind when you say erotic is the French surrealist poets, Paul Valéry, André Breton, that whole group of, they were dealing with symbolic language, even Asimic writing. And so there's the art activates the psyche. It's not always sexual. And at the same time, it's moving. And so I think that's what's important, is it's moving. Life is moved. One is moved by what they consider erotic. It's completely different than pornographic. And pornographic is
right.
just,
but the average person out on the street isn't going to have that erudite view of the world that you have, unfortunately.
Well, and I think what's important is to not make, diluted diet concepts all the time too, and assume that people can't. I think people can get more than I think we think. And I don't take the high-minded road. So anyway.
Right. Let's give Brian a shot here.
Well, no, I was just going to say that what I mean to say when I say erotic, I mean, it's an anti-convivial.
Mm-hmm.
What's listed here are things that are fun, that are the experience of art and embodiment. So I guess I have been taking it as a term of art, here, that there's logos and eros, but this is the rarefied Apollonian, crystalline, almost inanimate form, I think rejects this. And what I'm saying is that that has animated a lot in our current culture, is this whole rejection and splitting off and othering and also ascribing to it, things like, I don't know, sloth and gluttony, and it carries attributions, the convivial carries attributions that's not compatible with the Protestant ethic, let's say.
Well, yeah, the
Right.
7 deadlies versus the 7 virtues. I mean, in either way, it's still kind of a moralistic word that's trying to eliminate the erotic. I mean, as a word.
So the point is that we all have to reflect on what we're talking about here, okay, in terms of our audience. We all need to reflect on these things, and none of us has a definitive answer of this, and every one of us has a different definition for erotic and what that might mean to us. Let's read 724, and then that will be the last paragraph for today. Next week, we'll get into Christ and what he's doing in this vision. But
Shall I take 724?
Yeah, you take 724.
The destruction of all beauty and of all life's joys, the unspeakable suffering of the whole of creation that once sprang from the hand of a lavish creator, would be, for a feeling heart, an occasion for deepest melancholy. But John cries, "Rejoice over her, thou heaven, holy apostles and prophets, for God hath avenged you on her, Babylon," from which we can see how far vindictiveness and lust for destruction can go, and what the thorn in the flesh means.
Right.
Wow, the lust,
think,
vindictiveness, and destruction, and that's pornographic,
Yeah. So Brian.
Well, I was just going to say that gives. I think that this has given shape to this text, and how it, especially if it is not reflected upon, but seen as like an objective truth out here, and God and heaven and earth, the whole attribution of the whore of Babylon, which is that's the other side of the the whore and Madonna. So it's really archetypal because it's bipolar. But this focus on the whore of Babylon, this complex, I think it runs, a lot of domestic abuse. It runs a lot of abusive policy towards women.
Yep.
I mean, so I guess what I'm saying is this is all sort of heaping up onto one side of a dyadic archetype,
right,
that has had consequences of living this out in the real world when it's not an objective reality. What do we want to call it? It's not in the world we share issue or problem. These are psychological issues, psychological power. They're and yet they are not owned and put out there, and women are seen as, what was it? You've been avenged on her. Like there's some kind of propitiating. Somehow you're doing good by doing evil.
Yeah.
This is so twisted and bereft of its other pole.
Well, they can even support the demonization of sex by simply saying, "Oh, well, abstinence," because what happens is abstinence then becomes this symbol that they get, because it goes back to the virgin birth. So you have this religion trying to make rules about sex, when in reality, allegedly, there was no sex to create Jesus. So you get this divine, virgin birth, as it were. And that right there just feeds that symbol to somehow sex is not divine, because the divine didn't do that to make Jesus. and these things start to connect in strange ways that make people afraid and easily bent towards basically very immoral activity towards women. And as if, like you said, somehow doing this evil is the good thing. This is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you. I mean, it's like, no, it's not. So stop.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in the end, if you do those things, it is going to hurt you, because as the Bible says, on the day of judgment, we will see as we are seen, and that is a shattering experience. And it is a shattering experience for pretty much everyone, because all of us have made mistakes along the way, and they're painfully learned. That those experiences make us learn from pain what works better in life, let's say. And so, it goes back to the 1,000-yard stare of the war veteran coming back, and he can't talk about the war with his wife because, good chance if he was in a firefight and he was in a fight for his life, he might have done some things that were not particularly attractive or even legal, but nonetheless, he survived. And, I think that is basically this experience of every soldier who returned from war, that if you didn't participate in it personally, you at least saw it happening, and it was beyond the pale, and you don't want to talk about it.
And even on the omissive piece of just having suddenly your best mate's guts or brain pouring through your hands, just from, at one point you're here and the next point they're just liquefying right in front of you. And that's,
yeah, sure. I mean, all that is very traumatic. And so who wants to bring that up again when you come back into civilization, right?
Yeah.
And so anyway, let's call it quits there and come back to it is Christ who next week.
There we go.
Maybe he can save us in some way. One can hope.
Right.
So well, it's interesting too. What's strange, I think, just as one final kind of fine-grained piece, you're so right. When the people come back and they don't want to talk about it, and then a lot of people try to force meditation or quiet on them. And someone actually who's come back from war, their habitual accustomization is not quiet. It's firefight. And actually, because of that, then meditation and quiet on a war veteran straight away is actually dangerous because it's terrifying. It's so out of the norm for what they've just come from, that they have to be dialed in a way down to settle before things like meditation are even actually healthy. I mean, they're actually dangerous because now you're going to abuse them with the jarring piece of there's nothing jarring.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
And I know quite clearly what PTSD is and how it feels, because I have it very mildly. I always say I had a very mild case, or have a very mild case, but I know what those men must be going through, because my mild case doesn't bother me much. I know what it is when it happens, when I am thrown back into Vietnam, because of those two things that trigger me. It's really real. And so I have a very hard time being present for a big fireworks display, physically present. I don't mind. I love watching it on television, but I cannot
Ground.
sit out and smell the smoke and hear the actual bursts of the explosions. I cannot do that. And the other one is helicopters, and they fly by me very often because I live next to the Naval Academy. But every time a helicopter goes by, boom, I'm back in Vietnam. Fortunately, I know that those two things trigger me, so I avoid them, okay, to the extent possible. But
With helicopter,
I know if I had had a more intense experience,
Huh?
it would be much worse. It would be much, much worse. And
Right, of
because I
course.
know how vivid it is for me, and I haven't been in Vietnam for 51 years. Go ahead, Brian.
And those greater traumas result also not just the imprinting in the soma, like
Mhm.
even to feel, the percussion in your gut is like, that also is kind of triggering. But
yeah, yeah.
there's damage to the ego.
Right.
If it's bad
You
enough,
bet.
ego fragments or at least cracks,
Right.
and it leaves them like, as far as their ego strength is damaged,
Yeah.
Mhm.
and
Right.
these are the guys that act out. These are the guys that commit suicide,
Yeah.
because
Sure.
it's so bad
Exactly.
that the thing that we're talking about, they don't even have that available anymore.
Yeah, and
Getting to the healing of that is so complicated and so fraught with the things you would need to do to heal your ego are frightening, terrifying,
You
enraging.
bet.
and that concussion blast, the thing about I mean, like the gut, but also the cochlea and the ear,
Feel it.
it's actually literally psychologically disorienting that you actually have been squashed and then stretched and squashed and stretched. So just even that vibration piece of the pressure change is wiggy, and like you said, can actually bruise, damage, fragment the ego, literally, physically.
Well, and
That's big.
and my military experience is always with me, always, every second of my life, because I have tinnitus, which I know exactly where I got it, which was on the pistol range at Quantico, Virginia. And back in those days, we didn't force people to wear earplugs. And the result was I got tinnitus. I remember getting it at that time, and it has never left me. And I have tinnitus, and I think I've counted 12 frequencies. So it's like hearing 12 different fax tones simultaneously.
Mhm.
Okay, but the solution to it is pretend it doesn't bother you.
Mhm.
Okay, just to the extent you can, ignore it.
To try to move through the eye of the storm, whether you're in it or not.
Well, yeah, or just move on. Don't dwell on it.
Right.
And they don't know what causes it still, but it's a real thing. And guys who were really in serious combat back in those days, man, they nobody can hear anymore.
Mhm.
I mean, interestingly, the tinnitus does not interfere with my hearing acuity.
Mhm.
Okay. I can hear very slight sounds for the most part. I mean, it's getting a little harder in my dotage now, but I always could hear the drop of a pin, for example, over it. But it's there all the time. It's there.
Mhm.
It's there right now, and it's there when I'm trying to go to sleep and every other damn thing. So
Yeah.
anyway, okay, let us
Thank you.
terminate
Thanks,
for
guys.
today, and we'll see you next week. And we'll be
Oh,
on.
yeah.
We'll be on tomorrow with 2 essays in analytical psychology again. And I am continuing on with my banned books reading. And today I hope to read chapter 8. I read chapter 9 last night, finishing at about 12:30 this or 0030 this morning, and there were already 100 people who had watched it when I got up this morning, or about 100. It was 99 when we started this session. So anyway,
Any book worth banning is worth reading.
absolutely. Absolutely. So if you hear there's a banned book, run to the library, go get it, read it, because it's there to intended to warn you, and the people who are banning it are trying to prevent you from being warned. So
And the Margaret Atwood crowd had the idea to make a fireproof Handmaid's Tale, so they can get around the book burning by making non-combustible books. And they have a picture of her with a flamethrower showing how
well,
just
and look how ornery Hollywood is, because they've made a television series on it, and I don't know if it's still going, but they made it a week by week event, and so it's a very powerful story, and if you haven't read it. So anyway, peace, everyone.
all right.